now than ever, it feels as if reality is a lie. Be honest, doesn't it feel like things just don't work the way they promised they would work? History and science tell completely opposite stories, so which one can be trusted? The deeper you look, the more it becomes apparent that we are not in control of our own destinies. Not only this, but even time itself appears to be able to be altered and manipulated to fit an agenda that spans dimensional planes. From the Great Flood, to the Tower of Babel, to the Mud Flood and Tartaria, to the modern times, it seems more and more plausible that we are in the midst of a series of cycles, perhaps at the mercy of the Watchers, a race of spiritual beings perpetually fascinated by mankind.
Hello citizen, this content creator is a confirmed conspiracy theorist and has been subject to repeated penalties for spreading controversial rhetoric. Please proceed with caution, trust the government, remain silent. Your compliance is appreciated and, of course, non-negotiable.
I'm not gonna lie, researching this one made life feel very bleak. I found myself wondering at times throughout the day, was anything even worth it? Does anything matter? Has it ever? When did stuff start mattering? If the timeline really has reset and the relics of alternative timelines are nothing more than epic monuments, pyramids of mythical bygone realms, is there really anything to learn from these things at all? Or is everything on a fixed cycle, over and over, repeating with minor differences here and there, and all within an allotted amount of time? And we all just hope that if a reset occurs in our timeline, that it's the one that ushers in the golden age of redemption in whatever form that you visualize that as. Your guess is as good as mine, but the deeper I sunk my teeth into the idea of a reset only about 130 or so years ago from now, the more I felt the pangs of my own insignificance. And let's be honest, lately things have just felt a little bit off. For the most part, those who are experiencing 21 CD probably agree that we haven't been being told the whole story for quite some time. Sometimes that fact is a little bit more visible than other times. And in my opinion, right now is one of those times. It just feels like they're trying to cram a lot of world-changing moments into a single tiny space in time. In the past, this was typically how it was right before the Great Resets. I think a few we can point to immediately would probably be the Flood, perhaps the Tower of Babel. These are things that could be considered cataclysmic, that essentially changed the course of time. And there was a lot of explosive stuff going on in these times, and then just poof, a new era, a new age. A reset occurred, and from the ashes comes the new human way of life. And who knows how many times this has happened. It appears to be at least a few, though. And I believe that such a thing is about to happen again. So as I'm sitting here thinking that, taking into consideration the UFO disclosure, the war in Europe, the weird political agendas, I start to feel like I see signs. The signs that we were told to watch for. The signs that something big is about to happen. And it's going to change everything. And I'm sitting here considering this. And people are telling me to look into the last time there was a great reset. And it turns out it wasn't that long ago at all. Like I said, about 130 years ago. Most likely, according to this theory, in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. This is most likely when the most recent Great Reset occurred, assuming anything I say at all in this episode can be taken seriously, because this theory is wild. I'm warning you though, what you are about to hear might shape the way that you view reality. It certainly did something to me. To understand the present, we must look at the past. And by doing so, you will realize what the future will be. Because it seems it's the same as the present. The term Greco-Romans refers to the combination of cultural elements and influences from ancient Greece and Rome. Two civilizations that played central roles in shaping the course of Western history. And the Greco-Roman world represents this classical Mediterranean culture that developed from the convergence and interaction between Greek and Roman societies, especially during the period from the 5th century BC to the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. And the Greeks and Romans shared many similar aspects of culture and politics and religion and social structure, which collectively came to be known as the Greco-Roman culture. It was a real blend. And the Greek civilization was known for its incredible contributions to philosophy, art, architecture, science, and literature. Thinkers such as Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they helped shape Western thought with their philosophical works, while mathematicians like Euclid and Archimedes advanced science and mathematics. Hellenism, or Greek culture, began to spread widely after the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, which created a vast empire spanning from Greece to Egypt and even into Asia. And this expansion led to the blending of Greek ideas with the local customs and the emergence of this Hellenistic culture, which was characterized by an openness to various cultural influences. And then the Roman civilization began as sort of this small kingdom that eventually evolved into a republic and then a vast empire. And the Romans admired Greek achievements and actively adopted and adapted them to their own society. As they expanded their territory, the Romans came into contact with Greek colonies in southern Italy and later Greece itself, sort of absorbing Greek cultural influences. Roman culture valued law and governance and engineering and military organization. The Roman legal system, the principles of the Republic, and their concepts of citizenship formed this crucial part of the Western political tradition. And the Romans were brilliant engineers, building monument structures such as aqueducts and amphitheaters like the Colosseum and roads. Roman architecture was heavily influenced by Greek forms, including the use of columns, temples, and open forums. That's why their architecture looks so similar, is because it is basically exactly the same. The blending of Greek and Roman elements is evident in what we call Greco-Roman culture, and the Romans adopted Greek gods and myths, but gave them Latin names. Zeus became Jupiter, and Aphrodite became Venus, and so on. In art, Romans were inspired by Greek statues and styles, though Roman sculpture tended to be more realistic and focused on representing the person as they were, often in a way that emphasized their character. Philosophy also experienced this synthesis. Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle became well known among the Roman elites, and thinkers like Cicero and Seneca helped blend Greek philosophical ideas, like Stoicism, into Roman life. This fusion shaped Roman thought on politics, ethics, and personal conduct, of course. Religion in the Greco-Roman world was polytheistic, featuring a large pantheon of gods, and the Greeks and Romans each adapted to their own cultural context, and this is important. During the later Roman Empire, a significant cultural change occurred with the spread of Christianity, which would eventually become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. And that's also important. Christian thinkers like Augustine integrated Greco-Roman philosophy into Christian theology, leaving a lasting influence on Western religious thought. Education was another significant component of Greco-Roman life, and wealthy Roman families would often send their children to be educated by Greek tutors or philosophers, highlighting the value placed on Greek learning. The Greco-Roman world left a profound influence on Western civilization. It basically shaped the way things are for us today. And the ideas of democracy, republicanism, artistic style, architecture, literature, philosophy, and law, even the kinds of movies that we enjoy, they were all sort of thanks to this Greco-Roman influence. Many elements of Western culture, from the U.S. government, which is obviously based partially on the Roman Republic, to Renaissance art, which was inspired by Greek ideals of beauty and humanism, find their roots in this Greco-Roman culture. But why am I wasting so much of your time on this little history lesson, right? I would say it's pretty safe to say that almost none of us actually care about Greco-Roman architecture that much. But let me break it down for you. After years of research and humbly consuming and digesting ideas on the timeline upon which we all ride, the history of this planet, the history of this race, the history of God, I've come to kind of realize something. It appears that everything exists on a cycle. In one way or another, at any given time, there's a cycle going on. Just look at time. It's a 24-hour cycle. Look at the seasons. There are 4, defined in a yearly cycle. Look at the moon, the stages. Time itself is a cycle, and so is life. But so are deities and spiritual beings that seem impervious to time on a cycle. And it appears that these beings, who have relatively little concern for human life or how time changes us. And why would they not care about time or life or whatever? Why would they not care about hours specifically? It's because they're playing with God's toys. They don't care if they break them. And the angels and these demons and these godlike beings of which we have no image to even imagine them as are basically like us in a lot of ways. Before they fall, they exist in a state of free will, with their origin being perfection, and their free will capable of essentially allowing them to taste of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, just like Adam and Eve did. And if they choose to mess with, not in the same exact way, but sort of the same process, and if they choose to mess with God's creation in this negative way because of their free will, they become a fallen angel, no longer perfect. And many of these fallen angels end up creating Nephilim and mishandling humans in some way. Some humans may refer to this as alien abduction or hallucinations, visions, sleep paralysis, dreams, unexplained experiences or memories, or even the absence of some of these things. And just like us, these loser angels, these fallen ones, form groups and tribes and little cults of beings, and they wage turf wars across the earth, and they raid each other, and they argue over this planet and over us. But we are not simply caught in the crossfire. We are also the objects that they covet because of our souls and our value in God's eyes. It's interesting how some of the ideas that are circulating right now within modern hearing spaces are is the idea that we are a container. What do the aliens want? Well, they look at us as containers of sorts. Containers for what? What do we have that everything else on this planet might not have? It seems like a soul, maybe conscience. That's what we have. Is that what they're after? Can they take that out of us and put it in something else? How powerful are these watchers? But during these battles and these arguments, these fallen ones damage our ways of life constantly. They cause us to stumble and fall from grace and to acquire diseases and do horrible things to each other. They make us make bad decisions. They impact politicians and world leaders through physical manifestations and horrors beyond our imagination. And sometimes their battles and their manipulations and just their general mucking about bleeds into our world, leaving the invisibility behind. And we see it. And we try to rationalize and explain what we're seeing. But what it comes down to is we have no idea what we are seeing. So the humans start to become all too aware that their world is not at all what they thought it was. Or they reach some kind of higher plane and perhaps manage to save themselves in small amounts, say by heading inside the earth or beneath the oceans or something like that. But sometimes they are just nearly annihilated. The Great Flood, in my opinion, is an example of this, in which all but a single seed family was drowned in a global flood apocalypse. That was a reset by God. But it's my opinion that these fallen angels and deities can also trigger resets when evidence of them becomes far too strong in the world, or perhaps even at the request of powerful humans who wish to remain anonymous and yet still control the world. The shadow governments, the Illuminati, those types. I think they can manipulate these fallen angels who are so obsessed with humanity for some reason to trigger a reset, some sort of cataclysmic period that reshapes how mankind goes into the future, you know? And it really all depends on which gang of these watchers, these Elohim, manages to win their little turf wars a lot of the time. You know, these games that they play on our planet. And that's why histories and religions are so different throughout the whole world. And it appears that our ancestors met aliens and beings from outer space and beings from inside the earth and creatures that can go invisible and manifest things and just, you know, entire worlds that are inside the earth and under the ocean and all this stuff. Why is there so much of that if none of that happened? Well, they all experienced something. And that's why all of these histories and religions are so different. They all experienced maybe a different collection of Elohim, a different collection of watchers touched their presence on earth. The traces of the Elohim are everywhere. The watcher activity is visible everywhere. You got manipulated belief sets, alternative timelines. There's untouched tribes, strange mythologies. All of these things are evidence of this spiritual war occurring actively. And sometimes, in the midst of all this, something insane happens and a reset occurs. A lot of insane stuff has happened on this planet. And I think there's periods of time that we go through that we don't really realize that reality is shaping differently as we go through it. Now, as I've been saying, in the United States, I believe the last reset occurred sometime in the 1800s to early 1900s. And I say in the United States because I do think that some places can experience a reset while other places aren't. And remember, a reset is accompanied not only by a physical change, but a mental and spiritual transition as well. And that can happen with a specific group of people, excluding other groups who are far distanced from them. It's kind of like a cult thing, how cults develop the mentality that they develop seemingly out of nowhere. It's a bizarre change. It's like a funnel into a new reality. And in the United States, it was sometime in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And the gods, the Elohim, the Watchers, who were currently winning the spiritual war over the North American region at that time, were of these Greco-Roman origin. Those were these sort of deities, not in their actual presented form, like Venus looking the way she does, or Aphrodite looking the way she does, or Zeus looking the way he does, but like the beings that represented those, or the beings that were represented by those figures, I should say, were the ones who seem to have influence over much of the world, and especially North America at this time. One way or another, they were able to seize power over many other parts of the world as well, small pockets of places. Evidence of their dominion was presented in this glorious architecture, the Greco-Roman architecture. It's immediately recognizable all over the world, and therefore controversial. Why is it all over the world, though? Why was this style so influential? When standing in front of one of these buildings, you would not even be able to guess where in the world you might be. You could be in Rome. You could be in Greece. You could be in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, or Seattle, or Chicago, or LA, or Tennessee, or Germany, or Russia, or Peru, or pretty much anywhere else in the world. This is evidence of a nearly global dominion, in my opinion, by the spiritual overlords who masquerade as the Greco-Roman gods. I think this was a very specific age, an era of Elohim influence upon the planet in a big way. But war was coming. Okay, a sick, warmongering tribe of devastating Elohim. Because remember, these beings battle amongst each other as well. In my opinion, I do not think it's just there's good and then there's evil. I think that with the free will that they have, because I believe they do have free will, and with the free will that they have, they choose how to spend their time. So they beat each other up just as much as they beat us up. So this war was coming, and there was a group of spiritual beings who wanted to take over the North American region. And they would ride in on the wind and smite this Greco-Roman Empire and turn it into a wasteland. And that wasteland is the current age. Or maybe it was handed over peacefully. I have a couple different ideas. Let's talk about what could have happened during this war. And I know a lot of you guys are just like, yeah, you've officially fallen into the loony bin this time. And maybe I have. But I believe in spiritual things. I believe in things that are way out of our control. And this just seems like a spiritual representation of what is almost obviously visible. So in some places, I think this battle, this war, I should say, was violent, extremely violent. But in other places, such as the United States, it's almost like it was celebrated like a sacrifice at a party. It's almost like, you know, the United States was spared in a way. So, and we're going to primarily focus on the United States during this reset talk. And it's part of why the USA is basically considered the undisputed world leader. I think that this reset focused on the United States so that the United States could sort of have the power it has in this new future that was going to be ushered in. Okay? And some countries, to these Elohim, it's important to note, are more valuable than others because of the power and the devastation that those countries can yield. Because they're not playing puppet master with us literally, but they're manipulating us to do things, like convincing us to do things, convincing world leaders to go to war or to do whatever they may do. So they want to have control over the humans that have power, because through those humans, they also have power. And these gods, whoever they may be, the Watchers, the Elohim, the Anunnaki, if you're into the historical context, some might call them aliens, whatever they are to you, they clearly handed the United States over on a silver platter before the destruction and rebuild began and the reset occurred. But right before it did, everyone in the USA threw these huge parties, and they were called the World Fairs. And you can fill entire podcast channels with this topic, and many people do. One of the best, if not the undisputed champ, is My Lunch Break. Please go check out that channel if you're interested in this reset specifically, because he goes into such great detail on it that it's definitely worth a look. And he talks about Tartaria and the mud flood, which by now some of you are probably like, oh, he's talking about Tartaria and the mud flood. During this time, right before this reset, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we see a completely different type of human, though. We see humans that have bizarre technologies. And this is like, you can look at the photos, you can look at the videos. There's weird stuff going on. We see humans that have strange tech, and they have these insane megalithic civilization structures. It's like all these buildings look like our Capitol buildings and, other Greco-Roman, extremely massive, powerful structures. And we see many of their great buildings have doors that are sometimes 20 feet high, implying that there were 20-foot tall beings, perhaps, who were using these megalithic structures as well. I don't know. We see these bizarre structures that are able to be anchored to by airships. And we see things that are indicative of free-flowing electricity in the air that is able to be utilized by everything. We see a people wearing a vastly different style of clothing, one that almost seems to be shared by everybody, as if there is no real focus on the individual whatsoever, as if there's some kind of collective mindset. We see elegance and grace everywhere, and appears to be a civilization of celebration and plenty and very good times. So it would appear that the Greco-Roman gods, those beings, those lowercase g gods, led humanity on this sort of glorious adventure for a while during their reign. However many of them there were, this band of Greco-Romans who chose to be represented by that image, those spiritual beings, they played God with mankind for a while, as is their ability, and this was the result. And it was also accompanied by the construction of these marvelous, what we now call churches and cathedrals and basilicas in many locations, these huge, elaborate buildings with bells and organs and instruments of great size and significance. But these weren't just religious buildings. Some theorize that religion wasn't even really a massive thing in the world at this time, not in the same way it is now. And these churches were only taken over by Christianity after the reset. But before, they were essentially health emitters, like health factories, because of the frequencies that these structures would emit. They would exhume good health and healing to those all around them, just by the vibrations and the frequencies that they put into the air. And it would kill sicknesses. It's a very interesting idea, considering the massive amount of science indicating there is something healing and wonderful about vibrations and frequencies. The problem is when these lowercase g gods, these Elohim, the Watchers, play in God's playground, there are certain things that they just can't do, such as annihilate a majority of the human race. They are not all powerful, and there are rules that they have to play within. So we are still the human race traversing through these resets. That's why we are still here. And when you go through one, It's a very confusing and bizarre time period. And sometimes there's overlap memories from before. After all, you're not being physically picked up and transported to a new realm. It's still the same world. There's still going to be memories from before. I think where a lot of people get trapped or stuck on this reset idea is that, well, what? There's just nobody that we know prior to 1900? No, there were, and we do know these people. I'm sure, many of our family lines go back more than 100 years. It's not that big of a leap to take, however, that there was a period of mass propaganda and deception during a period of maybe traumatic issues. So you accompany traumatic issues with manipulation and propaganda. Maybe there's a lot of destruction going on, a lot of death, a lot of confusing things are happening, while at the same time, the unveiling of high amounts of really intense technology, and the people kind of get confused. But they still will remember the life before, even when they grow older and enter into the new timeline. They just don't know that the timeline has really shifted a little bit. So these people get brainwashed, and they barely notice the change, or there's some kind of elaborate excuse or reason for why the change occurred that makes sense at the time, but won't make sense later. And I can't help but think about the kind of stuff that they're trying to brainwash the kids with these days, and brainwash, well, literally half of the people in this country. You can split it down either way and take whichever side you want. Half the country is brainwashed in some way by some really, really, really strange ideas. Okay? So when I think about a reset being accompanied by manipulation so that the people sort of just gloss into the next time era without really thinking there's any sort of reset going on, I don't have to look far. I can just look to the people my age in my country. And listen, this isn't a Tartaria or a mud flood episode, and I'll probably have to remind you of that several times more before we reach the end. But rather an observation that we're experiencing things right now that we seem to have been experiencing during the last reset, what many people believe was the last reset. Not everybody will, but a lot of people do, especially people who entertain the idea of Tartaria or the mud flood. There's a lot of stuff that's going on around that time right now. And during that time, many of those ancient buildings are not appearing in pictures and charts and maps at the same time that it is said that they existed, that they were built. We're finding pictures omitting buildings that were very clearly there. And we can see, even back then, how they took these photos to the red rooms and manipulated them and cut out buildings and structures and features and then distributed those photographs to the news companies and the media so that the people could be manipulated by, Photoshop even back then. There's also the emphasis on the word founded with many of these buildings, which honestly leads one to believe that perhaps these buildings did exist prior to the date that they were founded. This is all part of the confusion surrounding the overlap from one reset into the next stage. That's how you explain it. Nowadays, it's hard to know when a photo is real or when a photo is AI, but that is also just all part of the plan. Back then, yes, they physically cut the photos and changed the photos and manipulated the newspapers. Now they can use AI to hide the truth. And you hide the real images in a swimming pool of fake images, because you can't delete everything. And as time goes on and people die, eventually even the real ones are just included in this deep pool of fakes. So the images that we see are often unexplainable and don't seem to align with real time periods. How are they building these amazing Greco-Roman structures with horses and buggies and no power tools? That's what I want to know. Why are so many of the images clearly modified, with the sky details being just completely omitted, and even features being painted onto the photographs sometimes in some ways to like show that they're being worked on or something? Why are so many photos clearly edited in sort of a barbaric way that doesn't even hide the fact that they're edited? It just hides the reality of what actually existed back then. There must have been an abundance of evidence in the sky for a different reality that humans were undergoing back then. Why would you cut the sky out so often? That's why all those images have that really just bleak white sky. The fact that there are no images of these buildings being constructed, and when we do happen upon any of these types of images, not only are they often seemingly edited, but they are also really just displaying scaffolding. Where did all the stone come from, and how did they transport it? Why is there no historical account of this kind of stuff? A lot of these buildings, if you investigate when they were built, there doesn't really seem to be an answer. And most of the architects who are allegedly responsible for building these don't really have much of a past to report for some reason. We're always looking at the ancients, and we're like, how did they do it? Well, they did it with horses and buggies, right? Allegedly. But how did the people in the late 1800s do it? Because for some reason, they hadn't invented past the horse and buggy by then. When you look at the size of these structures and the size of these doors, it does make you wonder. And then around this time, they're also digging up giant bones. We can't forget that during this time, they were uncovering all those giant bones. Giants reportedly lived in the earth during these times. They were reporting them. Is it possible that humanity had a close relationship with giants, but finding them dead was a bit of a rarity, and that's why they were in the newspaper if they dug them up? Just because they were finding and reporting giants in the newspapers doesn't mean that giants didn't actively exist while those newspaper articles were being written. Is it possible that humanity had a closer relationship with them, and that they helped build these buildings? Is this because the giants were the sons and daughters of the spiritual beings themselves? The ones that were working so closely to make this particular group of people experiencing such a life of plenty? Perhaps those articles are evidence of those people discovering something from a time before the reset prior to their reality, when giants may have also existed in a different capacity. But like I said, this isn't a mud flood episode. I do believe a reset occurred back then, and we can go into the nitty-gritty specifics of what that reset entailed in another episode. The reason I'm talking about it today is because there appear to be parallels that are unmistakable between the reset that occurred in the late 1800s to early 1900s and the reset that is occurring at this very moment. The parallel occurrences and evidence suggesting that they are indicative of a new reset are staggering, in my opinion. Like coming very soon type staggering. Walking hand in hand with the idea that there was a reset in this, early 1900s time frame are the World Fairs and the Great Fires. Those are also things that are very memorable in these times. Great fires were occurring in almost every major city in the United States during these times. Just look it up. These fires are popping up constantly in these cities. Look at the history of these fires. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. These great fires are torching major portions of large cities yearly during these times. It's almost like all of a sudden, we as humans just forgot how to live with fire after rising to this extremely advanced and technological state of being with these huge stone buildings, which, by the way, stone doesn't burn like that. I just refuse to believe that we were so stupid that we couldn't figure out how to live this far, advance this far, and this long, only to accidentally torch our entire nation with candles. So what was really going on with these fires? The most famous of which, of course, is this Great Chicago Fire, which we're supposed to blame on a cow kicking over a lantern. Like, you've got to be kidding me. But these fires would be the catalyst to usher in the next age. They would carry us forward. Through these fires, the reset occurred. Remember, catastrophic events, repeatedly, over and over, just melting the people into mush. Highly manipulable in times of crisis, right? This was a reset in the making, and in a way, a soft apocalypse. The Great Fires in the USA occurred in these megalithic cities, and during that time, they destroyed many of our great buildings and remnants of the old world. But wait a second. These buildings are not made of wood. They are made of stone and granite and marble, very hard materials that don't melt in a wood fire. Similar to how jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams. It's almost like the same exact technology may have been used back then as was used today to sort of manipulate things a little bit. And yet they want us to believe that these fires somehow destroyed all these fireproof buildings. And when you look at the photos of these fire locations in the United States, they look like war zones. The photos of these cities after the Great Fires took place literally look like photographs out of World War II that were completely, where the towns were completely just bombed, just totally bombed out. So what are these photos actually showing? Because I don't know about you guys, but I've seen a lot of fires in my life. And I have never seen a fire do this kind of devastation to stone structures. Usually everything is just sort of burned out of the stone structure, but the shell remains 100% intact because fire doesn't melt stone. And why were so many buildings burning down in so many towns at the same exact time? So not only did we forget how to live with fire and we forgot that we could burn stuff with it, we also didn't learn from that mistake from city to city within our modern age. That also doesn't make any sense because all of a sudden, all of these cities all over the country just started going up in flames and nobody's asking any questions. It's almost like it was coordinated arson the whole country wide. A sort of project that would occur over the course of a few years that would eliminate evidence of an ancient old world, and a lot of that was in the form of structures, technology being hidden, destroyed, taken back by those that are in control, so that in the next timeline, after this reset, this new age coming forward, they won't be as technologically advanced in the same way. And we also have to remember that time travels differently to spiritual entities than it does to us, and that's perhaps one of the reasons that they desire to be so near to us and like us. They might want to experience time. But I digress. Too many cities are burning down too close together in time and proximity. And during this time, there are even times when the governments in those cities would actually use explosives to destroy the very buildings that are on fire and the adjacent buildings in hopes that it would stop the fire. This process was called fire breaking. And through fire breaking, they would just blow up everything in hopes that the fire would stop. And let's not forget that during this time, they were also dumping the giant bones into the ocean. And during this time, they were paying farmers to dig up burial mounds because we got to get all that evidence of the giants and we've got to destroy it. We've got to prepare for the new age, because in the new age, after this reset, the giants are not going to exist. It's possible. Again, it's possible. We're talking about some crazy stuff here today. It's possible that the Greco-Roman era lived with giants, but this new age of man will not. Think of this like the Tower of Babel when everybody was confused and all of a sudden had to start speaking different languages, and they didn't understand each other because of what they were capable of. Those were also sinners. Let's not forget. Even then, humanity had to be disrupted because of what they were capable of. There's something about mankind where when they are united, they are capable of doing things that stagger even spiritual beings. And I don't think we should forget that. It appears there is a power to us that we don't know about. And sometimes when we reach to that power, they have to reset us a little bit. So anyway, you've got these people blowing up tech, blowing up buildings during these fires, using these fires, this arson mission as cover up for the destruction. So it's probably not even very surprising to learn that there's a whole lot that can be covered up by blowing everything up during a citywide fire. You know, it's kind of hard to nail the crime scene down on that one, but this isn't the only bizarre thing about these fires. As if completely melting or destroying stone, completely destroying all evidence of this civilization's construction, leaving behind absolutely no evidence whatsoever of how we even built these buildings, or who built these buildings in a lot of cases, or where they actually came from, because the further down the rabbit hole you go, you quickly come to realize that there is no real traceable history to many of these buildings. As if all of that isn't crazy enough, you have strange accounts of people witnessing fires. Specifically, the one we're going to talk about is in Jacksonville, the Jacksonville fire in Florida in 1901. And they've got some very strange reports, some of the people do. People reported their personal belongings spontaneously combusting on their person as they watched the fire from a distance. They had exited the danger zone, and their items were spontaneously combusting, which implies that there was some kind of technological aspect to all of this that is not being reported in the history books. Some people reported their clothes. So what is this pointing to? Some kind of energy weapon? What causes that? How can you be at a safe distance from fire and still be burning? Something must be causing you to burn. The devastation of these fires is absolutely incredible to behold. And when I look at these images and I see this footage, I cannot, for some reason, believe that this is all just a product of some kind of fire because a candle fell over. This is clearly a war zone. This is the product of some kind of technology or weapon being used on regular folk to erase or eliminate something that isn't supposed to be there anymore. And with all of these fires occurring at the same exact time within the same small area and time period, there's no way in my mind to deny that this was an intentional transitional period to, the 1900s. And I do also believe that the beings who were orchestrating this event tricked us. And they were tricking us during this time period. Humanity didn't even realize what was going on. We were just like, why is everything burning? Not realizing that there's a transition going on. The kingdom is swapping hands. And when I look at these images, I can't help but remember some other images that I've seen recently. Images of Maui. Look at the destruction in these photos from old world America and compare them to these photos of Maui, Hawaii in modern times. The destruction is exactly the same. There's absolutely nothing left. Some buildings are touched by the fires and some are not. Some colors are and some aren't. It's like a direct energy beam, almost meticulously mapped out what should and shouldn't be destroyed. We didn't believe that was a natural fire for a second in the case of Maui. So why should we believe that these fires from old world America were natural at all? People want to talk about a mud flood, and perhaps that was an element of this mini apocalypse during this time, this Tartarian time, but it might not have been all mud flood. Maybe there were mud floods in certain areas, but definitely what there were fires that were somehow burning stone buildings that now we have no idea who really built or when they were actually built. And this was in the early 1900s. That's not that long ago. There's history of our own country, the people who built buildings in our country that we don't know. So they're trying to tell us where aliens are coming from? Bruh, it's the same weapons being used by these same warmongering gods, these Elohim, these watchers that are running the show right now. And I believe hands are changing yet again with this new era coming. They're being used yet again, these weapons, on the people of this planet. The manipulation, the propaganda, everything is shifting. And these Elohim, they like to masquerade as these technological overlord alien beings. I think they really get a kick out of it. And they run the show of this consumer interested, materialistic, emphasis on consumption, devoid of real substance kind of world. And that's why they project themselves as sort of this pinnacle of that world through advanced technology that we can't comprehend, so we consider it magic. The reason we can't know the truth about aliens is because if we did, we would find out this secret. And that kind of changes everything, doesn't it? Knowing that nothing is in your control, that this has happened once, twice, 3 times, who knows how many times, and it's going to happen again probably soon. But there's a little bit of a timeline element on this as well, because there is the divine amount of time that has been designated before Christ returns, right? But with this time limit, we have the perfect recipe for chaos and total loss of control. And I believe that when the spiritual beings lose control of humanity, humanity is capable of insane things. And that is why they can't lose control. And that is why the narrative has to be reset over and over. So we lose track of time, and so that they can maintain control and shake us up a little bit. And it appears that right now we are seeing that same technology torturing communities for materialistic gain. Corporate greed, gluttony. These are the fun elements of life to this current regime. This is how they run the world. This world that they have churned up. This world that governs status by the amount of material that you own. It's not the way it was in the old world. Perhaps that's where the saying, remember the good old days, really comes from. And that's why we ask ourselves where the good old days went. Well, sometimes literally the good old days don't exist anymore because that way of life is gone. And they've also, I thought this was ironic, torched Honolulu before. Take a look at these images. If you were watching me on YouTube, you could see this. Again, it looks like a war zone. And guess when this happened? 1900. These types of fires are not normal. But again, the evidence of this global old world civilization that thrived on glory and beauty and abundance and perhaps was integrated with tech in a way that we don't know how to do nowadays. You know, a little bit of proof of this existence was in Honolulu, and that had to change. So did they use these direct energy beams back then during a little reset, and now they are back again to use them again for the next one? But also using them because these beings are a little bit more inclined to appeal to their materialistic desires and those of the humans that they ride incessantly. And so they don't mind doing business with those humans if they get something from them more easily than they would if they had to get it themselves. Maybe that's the souls of children, and that's why so many kids go missing. Or maybe it's something else. There's literally no end to mankind's cruelty, and we're talking about crazy stuff, so it literally could be anything. And throughout history, we see evidence of rocks melting as well, by the way. We see ancient structures melting. And someday we will talk about that as well. But it seems that no matter where you look in time, you find evidence of rock melting, whether it's natural stone or some kind of ancient structure that has been heated to the point that the stone is like dripping. And what would cause that? Perhaps the same tech that has been being used to usher in these new ages and eras all along. It is an angelic tech. And these really are all structures from a long lost time and people that simply don't exist anymore. Or at least don't exist in the same way that they did back then. There are even ways to tie this in with the idea that the entire Earth at one point was terraformed by a race of people or beings or a combination of the two. And that's why there's so much evidence for the inner Earth idea. And so many stories of lost civilizations that have gone inside the Earth. Was this to avoid the laser beams that were going on the surface? It's possible that one of the resets literally did send many civilizations or several civilizations or even just one into the Earth. And whether this was a global civilization or, just a smaller one like we see today, like with all these different countries and stuff, who knows? But they were driven inward. And when we look at many of these ancient sites where we see people, especially in the Middle East, carving into stone like it's easy, and we see it all over the world, but when you look at some of these megalithic sites in the Middle East and parts of Asia and basically anywhere where you find some kind of stargate like Peru, you come to the understanding that these people had an advanced knowledge on how to cut and utilize and move stone. And it seems to be a technology that the current civilizations of the world don't emphasize or put any real value on, because we are more interested in temporary, cheap existence, because beauty and glory and abundance are not features of this world in the same way that they were in the old world. So those are absolutely remnants of long lost times and different planes of existence where the technology was advanced, but also still ancient. But only on the linear line of time are they ancient. It's possible that those people in every other way were far more advanced than us. And then the reset occurred. Humanity grew too strong. The Elohim lost their grip. They manipulated control, and the spiritual beings had to step in. Remember that we're created in God's image, which entails creativity, imagining the space beyond the space that we know now. These are all things that are included in being made in His image. We wonder. And left to our own devices and given forbidden technologies, we can probably achieve a status that removes spiritual beings from control. I firmly believe that. I think it used to be easier for us, and now we are basically these small ant-like creatures compared to what we once were, but I still believe that that is possible. And, that's one thing that could trigger a reset as well. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we were ascending rapidly, so we had to enter a transitional period. Conveniently around that time, a spiritual war took place that transferred power to another collection of Elohim, and the narrative was given over to the shadow governments of the world and the story writers, like Rockefeller. He is no doubt responsible for the majority of the timeline as we know it today, because somebody had to be in charge of writing out how the humans were going to continue to go. And of course it had to be a human, somebody who could actually be on the earth with the humans like the humans were. So the insane asylums went up for the adults who couldn't conform. There was a massive genocide of sorts. Fires were going up. Cities were exploding. Wars were breaking out. Many people died in these fires and during this transition. A lot of history is sort of just glossed over during this time period, but evidence of this old world was destroyed the whole world over. Bizarre baby incubators were displayed at these world fairs prior to the destruction, probably to sort of usher in a new age of people that were made in maybe questionable ways. The orphan trains that you've heard of started arriving. The images of whole cities with nobody in them began to appear. Buildings that were previously assumed to have not existed were seen in photos clearly outside of their appropriate timeline. Because it's a lot of work to change everything. And some things slipped through the cracks, and it looked very much like a time that was held captive in limbo. And the accepted idea is that many of these great structures that weren't destroyed in the fire were actually temporary structures built just for the world fairs, and that's why they're in photos and on maps. They were only meant to be there temporarily, and then we tore them all down. So they were made out of plaster and sticks. But when you look at these images, that's so obviously not true. We have people on the roofs, and these buildings are huge. They're massive. So I'm trying to imagine the capability of these things to withstand thousands upon thousands of people flowing in and out of them. The weather, the elements, because these world fairs were no small deal. Thousands upon thousands of people, perhaps millions of people, walking through these structures, here to see the displays of America. Millions of hands touching the walls, and children running and bumping into things, animals, people just being exposed to all sorts of foods and amazing things in these temporary structures. It just doesn't make sense. They would fall apart. These were not temporary structures. These were real. And look at these pictures. You can't tell me these were temporary. And the ones that still exist are remnants from that last civilization, that Greco-Roman era. And you can see evidence of it in every state in the United States. Just go take a look at all of our Capitol buildings. Because that's exactly what happened to those ancient Greco-Roman structures after the reset. The government took those buildings quickly, and everybody else began building in these lesser structures, these temporary type buildings compared to what they were living in before. These very small and wooden and plastic homes, these mass-produced cheap houses, and we continue that to this day. This wasn't because of some kind of sudden shift to a preference for a cheap life without technology. Because all that tech, remember, disappeared as well. The technology that the civilization prior to this time period, the late 1800s, early 1900s, had, the airships, most likely a free energy source that was replaced by oil in this new regime. Transportation was easy throughout the world. Everything was glorious and moving towards a state of higher existence. So with the reset, then we're hit with the World War. Then we're hit with massive death, and we're hit with fires and calamity. We're probably hit with an alien invasion, maybe. Something that wasn't really documented properly, and then we're hit with a new narrative. And it's just being written because everybody's being brainwashed, and the adults are being killed off or sent to insane asylums or being indoctrinated. You get a reality that's left without all the good stuff and sort of forced to start over in these bad times. But we didn't evolve from primordial ooze. We didn't start as monkeys running around in the woods or being messed with. And so the timeline continues on God's clock. But it changed a little bit for us. One of these resets will be the last one. Hopefully, the next reset that's coming very soon to a town near you. And all of this is pretty creepy, right? And, maybe a little bit unbelievable. I think I understand it sounds wild to everybody who's listened this far in the episode. I know this is a little bit of a different type of 21 CD, but, I really wanted to get back to some of the real stuff. And I believe this is real stuff. I believe we're about to be handed over to another group of Elohim.
Second, I will work with all 50 governors, Republican and Democrat alike, to create the Great American State Fair, a unique one-year exhibition featuring pavilions from all 50 states. It'll be something.
You know? And I mentioned the correlations of Hawaii and the UFO tech and the laser beams and the fire and the erasing of history. A lot of that we're seeing right now. You know, we've got the destruction of history that isn't politically correct. We have agendas. They hate me because of what I look like. We got all sorts of stuff like that going on, too. I know you guys know what I'm talking about. And it's wild to me that we can go through this whole era, but we can't understand how brainwashing could occur that would cause a reset. When we have literal children growing up on different planes of existence than we are, and not in a good way. There's a man far away across the ocean. His name is Vladimir Putin, and he preaches out against these shadow governments of the world. There's something he knows about these global elite, and something more he seems to know about the supernatural. And he may even have knowledge of inner earth kingdoms or lands beyond our current allotted map. He definitely seems to know stuff that other people don't. And he has these magnificent churches for his armies. And when you see these things, they're so Warhammer coded, it's insane. These churches look like they're straight out of a fantasy movie. And they are part of the Russian military complex. It's insane. It reminds me of the churches that existed during this prior timeline, if such a timeline existed. And it makes me wonder if these churches in Russia could be possible that they're wielding some kind of tech, or maybe attempting, experimentation on some kind of long lost science they believe to have existed of healing and health manipulation. Listen, guys. Obviously, this was a very speculative episode, and I wanted to get it off my chest because I've also had a lot of stress lately. And there's a lot going on in the world these days. It really does feel like we're in the dark ages of sorts. So, who knows what's actually happening? If you don't ask the questions, though, and you don't talk about the weird stuff, you'll never move the conversation. We'll just all be sitting in the same echo chamber saying the same stuff. So thanks for sticking around if you made it this far. Thanks for experiencing 21st century dystopian. Don't drink the water. Question everything.